Sorry, I was muted. Now that we've learned how organisms are classified, um, and uh, how we handle that classification, how we put it together in a hierarchy and name species, now we can look at how we visualize that, how we can group those organisms together and display them visually so we can see relationships amongst organisms, either at very closely related individuals, or we can go to very broadly related individuals, right? And so what you see here, this is called a cladogram. So we're going to start to see a lot of cladograms, or what are called phylogenetic trees, right? And so this one is showing us a very simple phylogenetic tree that is showing the 3 domains of life. So you saw before, showed you kingdom, phylum, class, order, families, genus, species. Well, above all of those, even broader than kingdoms, are the 3 domains of life. And so they're based on fundamental molecular differences. And so we've got the domain bacteria, which we talked already about this semester. We talked a little bit about archaea this semester, so they're in their own domain. And if you recall, we did look at those as single-celled prokaryotes, right? And they had different properties in their cells. And that's what split them into 2 different domains. And then the rest are the domain eukarya. So these are all the organisms that have eukaryotic type cells. Okay. What's interesting about classification of life in science is that as we develop new technologies and learn new techniques of looking at organisms, we may change this classification scheme. And so a lot of what we'll look at is look at the old way of classifying organisms and how the new techniques that we've developed either back that up or it changes things. And so to that end, there's actually been new data that shows that the core genes of eukaryotes actually came from archaea, and that an archaea may have been a host cell in an endosymbiotic event that led to the eukaryotes. And so there are some scientists arguing now to put eukarya as a classification under the domain of archaea. But we'll see. But at this point in your education, we have 3 domains, okay? Hey, in my education, we only had 5 kingdoms. Now we have 6 kingdoms. So and I think even before that, in my parents, they had 4 kingdoms. So things do change. So again, this is showing a phylogenetic tree. It's a way to just graphically show the hypothesized evolutionary relationships among those with a common ancestor, right? So each vertical line here shows that organisms along that line are descended from one another. So every branch will be a new organism, and those that branch closely, they share a more recent common ancestor. So this phylogenetic tree shows that all life shared a single common ancestor, but we believe that the bacteria were the most ancient life forms that we see today that branched off, and then later on the archaea branched. So again, while we do share a common ancestor with bacteria, we share a more recent common ancestor with archaea. So we have a more direct line of descent from archaea than we do with bacteria. But again, the similarities in cells among all 3 of these groups suggest that there is a common ancestor. But if you remember from the lecture on evolution, I believe it was, that the way to get genes isn't only from descent. It isn't only from inheriting from predecessors, right? We saw there was something called horizontal gene transfer, right? And so that's what this phylogenetic tree gets a little bit more complex, showing not only more groups now instead of just showing the domain, it's showing different groups of bacteria and archaea. and then also the eukaryotes, and showing again that vertical line of descent. But it is now, this one is layering on the horizontal line of descent. And so horizontal gene transfer. So again, for example, in an endosymbiotic event, that's how you can get a horizontal gene transfer. So in eukaryotes, we don't have a mitochondrion because of lines of descent of reproduction from bacteria. It actually came from a eukaryotic cell eating a bacteria, a proteobacteria, and didn't digest that proteobacteria, but the proteobacteria continued to make energy, which benefited the eukaryotic cell, right? And that's the same thing happened with chloroplasts for the plants and the algae. Okay, so again, phylogenetic trees can be very simple, they can be very complex. It just depends on the type of data that you're looking for. Here's a fun thing to do: just Google phylogenetic trees or cladograms, something like that, and in the images, and you can see some really complex ones. You might need computers, depending on what traits you're looking at, you might need computers to generate some of them today. So we're going to look at some simple ones so that you guys understand what a phylogenetic trait. So again, so this is a real simple tree referred to as a cladogram. So it's a type of phylogenetic tree. Each branch on the tree represents a clade. So remember, we said a clade was a group of organisms with a common ancestor. So again, this one's very simple, just showing the 3 domains of life, right? And it's hypothesizing the common ancestor that occurs between the 3 domains of life. But it also, using a simple one, helps you understand a little bit better how to read a cladogram. So each branching point then is called a node. Let me put my laser on. So here you go. This is called a node, and it represents the divergence of 2 or more groups from a more recent common ancestor. So all along the way here, there may be different organisms that are in line of descent of both eukarya and archaea, but what had happened was there was a common ancestor that diverged. So this could have been a population of single cells that experienced a split in their population, and the other group had a different environment. And so they evolved differently, and that may have then led to the archaea. And again, that new data suggests, with the genes of eukarya sharing with archaea, that it might have been a group of archaeans that split, producing the eukaryotes, right? So this is why we say, and I wonder if you caught this in previous lectures, we might say that like convergence evolution is traits that were acquired just by natural selection of adapting to the same problem in a different environment, but they didn't get it by descent because they don't have a common ancestor. So really what we're saying is they don't have a recent common ancestor. And so when that trait developed, it's not because a common ancestor had that trait and they both developed it. So in general, so over time, we have an overall common ancestor. There is relationship between all organisms. And again, that's something, an idea that Darwin came up with that's really been upheld. But we're talking about a more recent common ancestor. Okay, and so this divergence here at the node will show that now there are different traits that eukarya have that the archaea didn't get. So we would call those derived traits or derived characters. Okay. Okay. You know what? I actually wrote myself a little note, because in a previous lecture I did say that, you know, we did the example of the echidna and the aardvark having the long proboscis, and that might look like physically that they're descended from a common ancestor, and we said that they were not related. Well, they are not recently related. So in the point of view that they are related because they are all mammals, but one is a monotreme and one is a marsupial. And I actually found a simple cladogram of mammals that kind of show that. So here you can see different types of mammals. So here, again, you can use different cladograms to show different things, right? So this is a cladogram somebody came up with to just show the relationship among mammals. So there was a common ancestor for mammals themselves. And then we saw a split. We saw some mammals retain the egg-laying properties, while others developed young inside of their body. That's called viviparity. And so both the marsupials and the eutherians got that. So this shows a derived character. So any organism that branches off after that derived character, they share that character. Okay, and so the marsupials and the eutheritans have development within their body, whereas the monotremes, the embryos develop in an egg outside of the body, much like birds and reptiles do. Okay, however, then the other mammals develop the placenta. So here you see a branch before the placenta, so that means marsupials don't have the well-organized placenta that the eutherians do, right? And then here you can go, they just kind of randomly showed, well, there's a cat. Well, the elephants have trunks, so if there's a branching, we could put a derived character there to show that elephants got trunks. So you can get even more and more specific as you go. Okay, so again, this one still showing a simple cladogram, but now we're just focusing on mammals. Okay, and then you might want to just focus on whales or, you know, something like that. So it all depends on what information you're looking for. You can draw all different types of cladograms. All right, here's a much more complex one. So here's a cladogram. It shows the 3 domains now, but now we've added on the kingdoms and phyla. And then also these are going to be, well, I'll discuss this in this lecture called supergroups. Okay, but again, so here you're seeing the most recent common ancestor to all living things, and then there was a branch of bacteria first. This can also show you time, right? So this shows you that the bacteria are the oldest organisms, right? Then we believe the archaea branched off, and then the eukaryotes branched off, right? And so this then also shows you amongst the bacteria which groups were more ancient than others. So it looks like the spirochetes branched off before the chlamydias, before the gram-positives, so on and so forth. Okay. We're actually going to look at the domain bacteria and domain archaea today, and we'll go a little bit about the domain eukarya just regarding the protists. So we already looked at protists. So we're going to start to classify organisms now. So you've had a semester of learning about these organisms. We're going to start to classify them now. Okay, so what we're doing, so a group of organisms can be referred to as a taxa or taxonomic groups. And again, they're based on their evolutionary relationships. And so when we form these cladograms, many of these cladograms were formed based off of old classification before we really understood phylogenetics and before we had better ways of classifying organisms. So the old, we don't completely redo the cladograms. Basically, we've been looking at old cladograms to confirm that they're correct or to modify the work. And we use, increasingly now, we use molecular data because we know that we used to just use physical traits because that's what scientists were limited to before the onset of even microscopes, or then also being able to sequence genes and other molecules. Now we can use molecular data because all physical traits are based on genetics, right? So if we go down to the molecular data, what we do is we look at different cladograms in order to determine if they're correct, or how to focus on what to look at to determine what we need to change, right? So the previous work has been done, has really showed 3 different types of relationships. Okay, and so one type of relationship will be a monophyletic group, right? So in a monophyletic group, this is the most desirable way to describe relationships among organisms, because this shows the ancestral species and all of its descendants. So you can look, if we had labels on here, you could look at, there would be an ancestral species, and you know all the ancestral, all of its descendants that are alive today. Right, that's where we want to get to, and we have several monophyletic groups like that. And so as you go through the different groups of organisms that we look at, you might be told, well, this is a monophyletic group or not. Okay, so again, in a monophyletic group, they have really well-defined shared derived characters. Okay, so for example, again, we looked at the mammals before. Like mammals have 3 small bones of the middle ear, they have mammary glands, and they have milk for their young. So that's what I mean by well-defined shared derived characters. They all have they're derived characters because they're not the ancestral trait. Okay, these are what all modern mammals have today, and we can trace that back to a shared common ancestor, and that the common ancestor would have that. The stem ancestor that split mammals off from reptiles and things probably wouldn't have that. But so a monophyletic taxon represents the true evolutionary relationships, and they include all the close relatives. So these would be all the mammals up here. So again, monotremes, maybe this is monotremes, and maybe this is marsupials here and placental mammals here. Again, every mammal has mammary glands, 3 middle ear bones, and milk for young. But you saw we split because monotremes still lay eggs. It's the eutherians that have the true placenta, right? So that's why we would still see a difference. Okay. So here's what we might call the sister taxa, right? Sister taxa share the most recent common ancestor. So maybe I'll go back a couple slides here. This one, right? The marsupials and the eutherians would be sister taxa. They share the more recent common ancestor than they do with the monotremes. Okay, so that would be sister taxon. Alrighty. Let's see, the next type of grouping is a paraphyletic taxon, or a paraphyletic group. So this contains a common ancestor, and some, but not all of its descendants. So it shares ancestral characters, right? So that's what the red shows, that they share the ancestral characters. So this is all the descendants, right? But the ones in the white may not completely share all of those characters. And so we're trying to figure out how they're included, right? So we talked about reptiles in the past, and that birds are actually related to them. Well, in the past, birds and reptiles were completely separate groups. And then they started to realize that they're probably related in some way. So it formed a paraphyletic group. Reptilia is paraphyletic because it doesn't include all the descendants of most recent common ancestor of reptiles, like birds. Birds share a common ancestor. And so, for example, if we look here at this node, this one might be lizards, this one might be dinosaurs. And so the birds we know fit inside of there are a close descendant of dinosaurs, right? But they haven't been included traditionally. And so this is why we say this is paraphyletic. So if we called this grouping the Reptilia, we have to include the birds in there, but they don't share all the traits as the other ones do. So we need to do more work with molecularly to understand where that fits into. And actually it's becoming more and more obvious that work is being done. Okay, so again, the traditional reptilia group didn't include birds in the group, but now we are doing that. So even today, when you're reading different sources on reptiles, they may or may not include birds. They may not include that. So they might refer to that as a paraphyletic group. The last type of grouping is called a polyphyletic taxon, right? These are several evolutionary lines that do not share the same most recent common ancestor, right? And it might be because that they were mistakenly classified them together because of similar features, remember homoplasy, that arose from convergence. We try to avoid these types of cladograms. We might accept them temporarily until research provides additional data. So we'll look at protists. Protists are polyphyletic taxon. We put them all in one group because they're single-celled eukaryotic organisms, but we've seen that they're very diverse. And so we're trying to find a way to categorize them to find their evolutionary relationships. We're getting there, and we'll talk about them a little bit later and how we're getting there. But right now, sometimes we just call it like the garbage can kingdom of Protista. It's just if you're a single cell organism, you fit there, but it doesn't really show the genetic relationship. Okay, so be aware of these terms because again, they come up now and again. And so you should know what we're talking about when we do that. Alrighty, so we want to start to get into the different domains. Okay, we're going to get into the domain bacteria, the domain archaea, and then as we get into the domain of eukarya in the subsequent videos or subsequent lectures, we will start to get into different phyla and sometimes classes. But here we're going to stay at phyla and kingdoms. And actually what I'll do is I'll end the video here. But this is a nice cladogram to end on to see that it's even more complex. We've added more phyla and kingdoms. And it is also showing the horizontal gene transfer. So when we come back, we're going to look more specifically at the domain bacteria and the domain archaea.